What secret was your family hiding from you? Grandpa who left us millions we didn't know about. My grandpa was a typical rural resident his entire life. He lived on a small farm in a remote village, worked the land, took care of livestock, and was an incredibly hardworking man. My family and I visited him every summer, and these trips became my favorite part of childhood. There was always something to do at Grandpa's house, from harvesting crops to caring for animals. And despite the hard work, he always seemed calm and cheerful. His joy in life was contagious, and he often said, "The key is to live in harmony with yourself." To me, Grandpa embodied simplicity and inner wisdom. His home was as modest as his life. A small wooden house built with his own hands, lacking any luxuries. Inside, there were old furniture pieces that seemed to have served for decades. His only luxurious possession was an old radio that he cherished, yet it stood dust-covered in the corner. Grandpa never spoke about money, wealth, or success. He taught us that true wealth lay in strong family bonds, good health, and satisfaction in what you do. When he passed away, it was a genuine shock for our family. He was someone we all regarded as an unshakable part of our lives, and his departure left a void that was hard to fill. After the funeral, we didn't expect any surprises. Grandpa left behind the farm and a few small items of emotional significance. We were certain that the inheritance would be minimal, since his life had always been simple, devoid of excess. However, everything changed the day we opened his will. The lawyer began reading the document, and at first, everything went as we expected. He left us the farm, his old house, and a few parcels of land. But then, the lawyer said that Grandpa had over $2 million in his accounts. I remember sitting in complete silence with everyone, unable to believe what I had heard. It didn't make sense. How could an ordinary farmer have so much money? We had never seen him with expensive things. He never spent large sums and always seemed completely satisfied with his modest life. We began to investigate the matter. At first, it was hard to believe that it was true, but gradually we uncovered the real story of our grandpa's life. It turned out that over the decades, he had managed to amass significant wealth, but not through the usual farmer's income. Back in the 1950s, when land in his region was inexpensive, Grandpa began buying parcels actively. Many of the neighbors found this strange, as the land then didn't hold much value, and no one expected these parcels would eventually become so valuable. But Grandpa was attentive to changes in the market and saw how cities were expanding and land was becoming scarce. Additionally, we discovered that he started investing in stocks back in the 1960s. He meticulously followed the market and chose companies that had growth potential. For him, it was a hobby he engaged in during his free time when he wasn't working on the farm. We had no idea that our simple and modest grandpa was so financially savvy. His strategy was so successful that by the time of his death, his investment portfolio had multiplied, bringing him significant returns. Yet Grandpa never spoke about his financial successes. He believed that money shouldn't change people, and that's why he kept it hidden from us. His main goal was to maintain simplicity and humility in our family. He didn't want us to change our attitude toward life because of money, so he lived as if he didn't possess this wealth. His legacy for us was not only material, but also a moral lesson that true wealth lies elsewhere. This revelation turned our understanding of Grandpa upside down. He turned out to be a much deeper and more complex person than we had thought. His humility and devotion to family hid a man with a brilliant mind and extraordinary investment acumen. He could have lived in luxury, but he chose a life in harmony with nature, alongside his family. After this event, our lives changed. We received an inheritance that could allow us to live without financial worries. But we always remember Grandpa's lessons. Money shouldn't change a person. It can provide comfort, but true happiness lies in the simple things. In love for family, in satisfaction from daily work, and in harmony with oneself. A few years ago, while helping my grandmother clean out her library, I stumbled upon an old, worn diary. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, and its cover looked like it had passed through many generations. This diary held secrets that I couldn't have imagined. When I opened it, I found the pages filled with neat handwriting and vivid drawings. I began to read, and with every line, I felt like I was uncovering a part of a family history that no one had dared to tell. As it turned out, this diary belonged to my great-grandfather, who was an artist during the interwar period. His entries spoke of dreams he cherished, the struggles he faced, and his boundless love for painting. I read about his desire to create something magnificent, how he fought with inspiration and self-doubt, and the love he had for his family, who always supported him, even though they couldn't fully understand his artistic pursuits. But what intrigued me most was a particular page where he described a secret exhibition that no one in the family knew about. Imagine, an artist living in a turbulent time when political circumstances significantly affected cultural life, holding his personal art show in a closed venue. This exhibition became his way of expressing protest, finding like-minded individuals, and sharing his creativity with others. He only invited a select few who were willing to appreciate his art. But as it turned out, even this small audience couldn't recognize his talent at the time. Determined to dig deeper into this revelation, I started searching for information about my great-grandfather in local archives, publications, and even old newspapers. Sometimes it was a real challenge, as materials in libraries were very old, and some had even disappeared. However, I didn't give up. I discovered that, during that time, my great-grandfather was involved with other artists, some of whom became well-known, while others were forgotten. As I gathered enough materials, I decided I needed to share my findings with my family. We all came together for a family dinner, and I recounted the story of the diary, his entries, and the secret exhibition. My grandmother was stunned. She had never heard about this before. She was filled with emotion when she learned that her father was an artist who had tried to leave his mark on the world, but had faced failure due to circumstances. We decided that this legacy shouldn't be forgotten. Remembering my great-grandfather's wishes, we organized an exhibition of his works at a local gallery. Of course, we didn't have any original paintings, but I gathered copies from an album, as well as materials from the archives that highlighted his life and creativity. We decorated the gallery with his drawings and photographs that I had collected, and included pages from his diary so that viewers could feel his spirit. This event became significant for our family. At the opening of the exhibition, many people attended, including not only our relatives, but also local artists who heard about it through word of mouth. They were amazed not only by my great-grandfather's talent, but also by his indomitable spirit. The audience was captivated by his works, and I felt that at last, his art was receiving the recognition it deserved. During the exhibition, there was a lively discussion where attendees could share their thoughts and emotions regarding his works. Many people shared their opinions on the importance of remembering art that doesn't always have the opportunity to be recognized, but is still vital for culture and history. I felt proud to give my great-grandfather a second chance to be heard. After the exhibition closed, we received numerous positive reviews and even offers for further exhibitions of his works. This experience marked a new phase in our exploration of our family roots and the recognition of creativity that had once remained in the shadows. I realized that our past holds immense value, and this discovery changed not only my perception of my great-grandfather, but also of the entire family. This event not only honored my great-grandfather's memory, but also brought the family closer together. We began to talk more about our heritage and explore our family history. Ultimately, I understood that each of us carries a part of our family within us, and it is important to keep those memories alive so that our descendants also know where they come from. When I was 21, I became fascinated with the idea of learning more about my family roots. There was always a story in our family that we had noble ancestors. My grandmother used to say that once upon a time, our forefathers were almost counts, or at least very wealthy people with a certain level of respect in society. These stories always intrigued me, especially because our family never seemed like it had any aristocratic blood. We were just regular people, living ordinary lives in a small town. But, let's be honest, it's always nice to think that somewhere in your genes lies a hint of blue blood. So I decided to seriously dig into researching our family tree. I started with the obvious: grandma's stories, old photos, and documents. Some things checked out, while others seemed rather vague. But the biggest question was this: I couldn't find any mention of my grandfather before he turned 30. The more I dug, the stranger it all became. There were no records of his birth, schooling, military service, or anything else that could point to who he was before settling in our town. It was a real mystery. It felt as though my grandfather just appeared at 30, and before that, no one knew anything about him. This bothered me so much that I started asking questions to my mom and aunts, but even they didn't seem to know much. At first, they didn't want to say anything, brushing off my inquiries with phrases like, "Oh, he just didn't like talking about his past," or "Grandpa was always a bit mysterious." But I could feel there was more to it. After a few weeks of asking questions, I had gathered enough to confront them directly. So one night, I sat down with my mom and aunt at a family dinner and said, "What are you all hiding about Grandpa?" At first, they nervously laughed, but when they realized I was serious, their faces changed. Silence. I sat there, waiting for someone to finally speak up. Eventually, my aunt, after a deep sigh, started to tell a story I certainly wasn't expecting. "Well, if you really want to know," she began, "your grandfather was actually a criminal on the run." My jaw dropped. On the run? It sounded so absurd that at first, I thought she was joking. But the serious look on her face told me otherwise. I was stunned. Back in the 1950s, before he met your grandmother, he was part of a gang that robbed a bank in the West. She continued. It was a big heist covered in the newspapers at the time. They took off with a huge sum of money and disappeared. But your grandpa managed to avoid getting caught, unlike the other members of the gang who ended up behind bars. He crossed several states, changed his name, and started a new life as if nothing had happened. I sat there, feeling like someone had poured cold water over me. How was this even possible? Grandpa had always been the typical friendly old man I remembered from childhood photos. He looked like the perfect example of someone who lived by the rules. How could he have been a bank robber? He was terrified someone would find out the truth. But you know what? After he settled here and met your grandma, he completely turned his life around. He became a respected figure in our town. He even helped rebuild the local school when it burned down in the 1970s. But only a few people knew his real story. To everyone else, he was just a good neighbor who liked to help out. I continued listening, trying to process everything. I was curious if he ever had the chance to reconnect with his past. My aunt explained that Grandpa never sought out his old partners in crime. He was too cautious, knowing the police could still be looking for him. But as the years went by, he probably decided enough time had passed and he just began living a normal life. He was a good father and husband, but his past always lingered, even if he tried to forget about it, my aunt concluded. My mom finally chimed in, confirming the story. She added that Grandpa was incredibly resourceful and loved reading crime history books, but he never spoke about his own history. After that, I saw family secrets in a whole new light. And while the stories of noble origins turned out to be a bit exaggerated, it turned out our roots were far more interesting than I could have imagined. Who would have thought that I was the grandson of a bank robber who turned into a respected citizen? My mom secretly worked for the government. When I was a teenager, my life seemed pretty ordinary at first glance. My mom worked as a middle school teacher, teaching literature, participating in school events, and often bringing home stacks of papers to grade at the kitchen table. We lived in a small house in a quiet suburb where everyone knew each other, and our lives felt routine, even somewhat predictable. However, there were some things I didn't quite understand at the time. For instance, my mom often left on weekends. She would always say she was attending professional development seminars or participating in school events with other teachers. This explanation never raised any suspicions, as my mom was the kind of person who always sought to grow and wanted to impart her knowledge to her students. Yet, every time she left, something felt off. She appeared more tense than usual and didn't take her typical suitcase filled with papers or books. Back then, I just went about my life, considering it the norm. Occasionally, I would notice her talking on the phone in a low voice, believing I wouldn't hear. I would walk by her office when she said things like, "This can't wait, this is critical for security," or "I'll prepare the report." It all seemed rather odd, given that she was a teacher. I thought perhaps it was something related to school, but her tone was different. More serious, even a bit anxious. One particular phone conversation caught my attention more than the others. I overheard my mom speaking to someone about some data she had obtained, and that intelligence needed to verify it. It sounded like she was working not at a school, but within some serious institution. I decided that I could no longer remain silent or avoid asking questions. It was too far beyond ordinary teaching duties. After that phone call, I waited until my mom finished and came out of her office. Then, I approached her and simply asked, "Mom, what are these data? And why are you talking to intelligence?" At first, she seemed a little surprised by my straightforwardness, but then she took a deep breath, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "You're old enough to know the truth." I was stunned. What could she possibly tell me that I didn't already know? It turned out my mom led a double life. A life I could never have imagined. My mom wasn't just a teacher. She worked for the government as part of a secret program. Her role involved analytical work with data related to international operations and negotiations between various countries. Her real job was so secret that even my dad didn't know about it. Only a few people were aware of her activities. Mom explained that all those seminars she supposedly attended were actually overseas assignments where she participated in negotiations with foreign diplomats, gathered intelligence, and submitted reports to special agencies. Her work was tied to international affairs, and she was part of a small group of specialists handling confidential issues at the highest levels. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mom, who appeared to be an ordinary teacher, was actually involved in intelligence work for the government? She explained that she had taken this job before she started teaching, and her ability to analyze large volumes of information made her an invaluable asset. She worked in a department responsible for gathering data on international threats, diplomatic agreements, and security issues. Her work was crucial for the protection of the country, but also dangerous, which is why she always tried to keep it a secret from the family. "Why didn't you tell us earlier?" I asked, feeling a mix of emotions, from pride to anxiety. "It was dangerous," she replied. "I couldn't put you at risk. I knew that if you didn't know anything, you'd be safe. That was more important than anything else." She explained that many of her trips were related to meetings with diplomats from other countries, and she had to gather intelligence, analyze it, and send it back to government agencies for further investigation. A small mistake could have serious consequences. It was strange to realize that all these years, my mom had been living a double life, hiding this not just from me, but from everyone around her. She was a true professional who managed to juggle these two radically different roles. I had always thought I knew her, but that was only one part of her identity. Behind the facade of a simple teacher was a person who was performing an important and complex job that couldn't be discussed even with those closest to her. After that conversation, my perception of my mom changed. I began to respect her more, but at the same time, I had many questions. How did she handle such responsibility? Why did she choose to reveal this secret now? Was there still danger for us? I also started recalling all those moments when she seemed tired after her trips, or when she appeared too serious, even though she was usually cheerful and welcoming at home. I still don't know all the details of her work. She didn't tell me everything, just what she deemed necessary. But now I understand that my mom is much more than just a teacher. She's a true hero who worked for the safety of our country, not seeking gratitude or recognition. So, here's my theory. My dad was a spy. And not just any spy, like James Bond level, deep undercover, secret identity-having spy. This all started when I was about 10 years old. Dad traveled a lot for work, and I use air quotes because he never really explained what his job was. He'd say he worked in international business, but that's just the most suspiciously vague thing to say, right? He'd be gone for days, sometimes weeks, then come back as if nothing happened. I always assumed he was just a regular businessman, but now that I'm older, the pieces don't add up. First, let me tell you about his gadgets. My dad has always been obsessed with technology. He has a drawer full of random devices, stuff I've never seen in any store. There was this one time our home Wi-Fi went down, and no one could figure out why. Dad walks into the room, pulls out this device that looks like a cross between a walkie-talkie and an old-school Game Boy, presses a few buttons, and bam, our Wi-Fi is magically back. I asked him what that thing was, and he just mumbled something about it being work equipment. "Sure, Dad. Sure." Then there's the time I found an old passport of his. I was snooping around in his study, looking for a charger, and I came across a drawer that had a stack of old documents. Inside was a passport with my dad's picture, but the name wasn't his. It had a completely different name and an entirely different birth date. I was floored. When I confronted him, he just laughed it off, saying it was part of a work prank. Really? A passport for a prank? That's some next-level office humor. But the weirdest part? The disappearing acts. I distinctly remember a few times when Dad would come home late at night, way later than usual, and he'd look different. His clothes would be slightly disheveled, his shoes muddy, and his face had this look, like he had been running or something. When I'd ask him where he'd been, he'd just pat me on the head and say, "Oh, just out for a late meeting." Meetings don't involve sprinting through the woods at midnight, Dad. Then, a couple of years ago, we were watching one of those spy thrillers, think Jason Bourne or something. And during a particularly tense scene where the spy is defusing a bomb, Dad leans over to me and says, "You know, that's not how it's really done." I laughed at first, but then I realized he wasn't joking. I asked him how he knew that, and he just gave me this cryptic smile and said, "I've seen a lot in my day." "What does that even mean?" I've been piecing all this together for years now, and I'm convinced my dad had some sort of secret government job. I mean, the evidence is right there. The gadgets, the fake passports, the weird nighttime activities, it all adds up. And now, I'm just waiting for the day he sits me down and says, "Son, it's time you knew the truth." Until then, I'm keeping a close eye on him, just in case the secret agents come knocking. Changed. After months of piecing together clues and connecting dots, I finally decided to confront my dad. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and he was lounging in his favorite chair, flipping through the channels while I fidgeted with the remote in my hands. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I knew this was the moment. "Dad," I began, trying to sound casual despite the pounding in my chest. "Can we talk about your work?" He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What about it? You know, the travel, the gadgets, the passport that isn't yours. I think I deserve to know the truth." Are you a spy?" A beat of silence followed, and I held my breath, watching his expression shift from surprise to amusement. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've been watching too many movies, kid. Come on, Dad, this is serious. You can't keep pretending. You've had all these weird things happening, and I can't ignore them anymore." His laughter faded, replaced by a contemplative look. "All right, let's say for a moment that I have had some unusual experiences. What would you think if I told you I used to work for a special operations unit?" I leaned in closer, my heart racing. "You mean it? You really were a spy?" He sighed, rubbing his temples as if he were wrestling with a heavy burden. "It's complicated. I wasn't just a spy in the way you see in movies. I worked for the government, yes, but it wasn't all glamour and car chases. Most of the time it was paperwork and late nights. The gadgets? Just tools for the trade, sometimes useful, sometimes just for show." I could hardly believe it. "So, you really did have a fake passport?" "Yes, but it was for security reasons, not for some wild adventure. The world can be dangerous, and it's best to be prepared." He paused, gauging my reaction. I did have to leave suddenly at times, but it was never as dramatic as it sounds, just routine. I felt a rush of relief and confusion. "But what about the cat stuff? You know, the strangling and the birds?" His expression hardened. "That was never true, I swear. There are things I can't discuss, things that can hurt people, but I never harmed anyone or anything. Those stories were misinterpreted. It's all part of a larger narrative, one I didn't want you involved in." "What do you mean?" He leaned back, and I could see the weight of his past in his eyes. "I made choices in my life, decisions that led to this kind of existence. I left that world behind to be with you and your mother. But the scars, the secrets, they stay with you." I sat back, processing this new reality. "So, you really were a spy, but you chose to give it all up?" "Exactly. I wanted a normal life for you both, something I never had. But sometimes the past has a way of creeping back in." He hesitated, and then added, "And I need you to understand. Not everything is as it seems. There are shadows in the world, and you'll have to navigate them with caution." "Is that why you were so secretive?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. I thought I could shield you from it, but now that you know, I want to teach you to be aware. There are dangers everywhere, even in the mundane." "Does that mean you still have connections?" I asked, a mix of curiosity and concern. He nodded. "I might, and it's not all bad. Sometimes it can help, but promise me, you won't go poking around looking for trouble. If you see something suspicious, come to me first." I nodded, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. My dad wasn't just some boring businessman. He was a man with a past, a complex, dangerous past that shaped him. And while I was thrilled to finally have answers, I also realized that I now bore the weight of this secret too. "Can we keep it between us for now?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, "but you better tell Mom the truth too." With that, I felt a bond form between us, one built on understanding and trust. I'd keep an eye on him, not because I doubted him, but because now I understood. The world was indeed a complicated place, and with my dad's secret life, I was about to learn just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting new content. Hit the notification bell to get alerts for every new video. That way, you'll always stay up to date with all the latest updates. Thank you for your support, and see you in the next video.